Okay, so someone hands you a company tomorrow that makes a simple physical product, a kitchen gadget, a yoga mat, a phone case, and sells almost all of it through Amazon. No storefront, no sales team knocking on doors, just a product listing that quietly generates orders around the clock while you sleep. Sounds like the perfect business. You've found a real profitable niche. You're riding the largest retail platform on earth, and Amazon itself handles the warehousing, the shipping, and most of the customer service. The honest answer is that this business can be extraordinarily lucrative, and it can also evaporate overnight because of a decision made by an algorithm you don't control at a company you don't work for reasons you're rarely ever told. The difference between the sellers who build genuinely durable brands and the ones who get wiped out in a single afternoon is almost entirely about how much of the actual business you truly own versus how much of it you're simply renting from Amazon. The first thing to understand is what you're actually building when you sell primarily on Amazon, because it looks like an e-commerce business, but it behaves more like a tenant relationship, similar to the anchor-tenant dynamics we've covered elsewhere in this series. Except here, you are the small tenant, and Amazon is the mall. When you list a product on Amazon, you don't own the customer relationship the way a traditional retailer does. Amazon owns the customer. Amazon controls the checkout, the shipping experience, the return policy, and critically, the entire discovery process, meaning which products show up when someone searches, and in what order. Your product's visibility depends heavily on Amazon's search ranking algorithm, a system that rewards sellers who use Amazon's own fulfillment and advertising services, and can bury a product on page 9 of search results if a competitor starts outbidding you on advertising or if your metrics slip even slightly. You are not selling to a customer. You are selling to Amazon's algorithm, and the customer is a secondary beneficiary of whatever decision that algorithm makes about your listing on any given day. Let's talk about what it actually costs to get a product to market this way, because the barrier to entry looks deceptively low, similar to the cryptocurrency exchange business covered earlier in this series, and that low barrier is exactly what makes competition in this space so brutal. Sourcing a simple physical product from an overseas manufacturer, often through sourcing platforms connecting American sellers directly to factories, can require an initial inventory order costing anywhere from a few $1,000s for a small test batch to tens of thousands of dollars for a meaningful launch quantity, depending on the product's complexity and the minimum order quantities factories require. Add product photography, a listing optimized with the specific keywords the algorithm rewards, and initial advertising spend to get the listing enough early sales velocity to rank favorably, and a seller can realistically launch a first product for somewhere between $10,000 and $50,000 total. Compare that to the hundreds of millions required to build a data center or the billions required to build a rocket covered elsewhere in this series, and you understand immediately why millions of people have attempted this exact business model and why the market for nearly every conceivable simple physical product on Amazon has become extraordinarily crowded within just a few years of any new opportunity becoming visible. Here's where the real cost structure of this business reveals itself, and it has almost nothing to do with the product itself. It's in the fees. Amazon charges a referral fee on every single sale, typically somewhere between 8 and 15% of the sale price, depending on the product category, simply for the privilege of selling on the platform. If you use Amazon's fulfillment service, where Amazon stores your inventory in its own warehouses and handles picking, packing, and shipping every order, you pay additional fulfillment fees calculated by the size and weight of your product, plus ongoing storage fees that increase substantially during the fourth quarter holiday season, precisely when sellers most need warehouse space for their busiest sales period. Layer on top of that the advertising spend nearly every seller now considers mandatory rather than optional because organic search visibility has become so difficult to achieve on a platform this saturated that sellers routinely spend 15 to 30% of their revenue on Amazon's own advertising products just to maintain a visible position for their own listings. Add all of these fees together, and a seller can easily find that Amazon itself is taking somewhere between 30 and 50% of the total sale price before the seller has paid a single dollar for the product, the packaging, or their own overhead. This fee structure creates a margin squeeze that catches nearly every new seller off guard during their first year, because the unit economics that looked promising on a spreadsheet during the sourcing phase often collapse once the full weight of referral fees, fulfillment fees, storage fees, and mandatory advertising spend gets applied to the actual selling price. A product that costs $4 to manufacture and ships for $2 might sell for $25, which looks like an enormous margin until you subtract a $3 referral fee, a $5 fulfillment fee, a seasonal storage charge, and $5 to $8 in advertising spend required just to generate that sale in the first place, leaving a genuine profit margin that can be shockingly thin relative to the headline revenue numbers that make this business look so attractive from the outside. Now here's the anchor tenant risk in its purest form, and it is the single most important variable determining whether this business survives long term. Amazon can suspend a seller's account, freeze their inventory, and withhold their revenue with very little advance warning, triggered by an automated system flagging a metric like a return rate, a customer complaint pattern, or a suspected policy violation that the seller may not have actually committed. Appealing a suspension means navigating a support system that is, by design, optimized for handling millions of sellers at enormous scale rather than providing the kind of individualized attention a genuine business dispute usually requires, and sellers routinely report waiting weeks or months for a human reviewer to actually look at their case, all while their entire revenue stream sits frozen and their inventory sits unsellable in Amazon's own warehouses. A seller whose business exists entirely inside Amazon's ecosystem has, in a very real sense, built their company on land they don't own, with a landlord who can evict them without a court hearing, and this risk is not a rare edge case discussed only in cautionary anecdotes. It is a structural feature of the platform that every serious seller has to plan around from day one. There's also a distinct acquisition market that has grown up around this exact business model, worth understanding because it shapes how many sellers ultimately think about building the company in the first place. Starting in the early 2020s, a wave of well-funded companies, often called Amazon aggregators, raised enormous sums specifically to buy up successful third-party seller brands, betting that consolidating dozens of individual product lines under shared operational infrastructure, shared advertising expertise, and shared supply chain relationships would generate efficiencies no individual seller could achieve alone. This created a genuine exit path for successful sellers that hadn't existed before, typically valuing a profitable Amazon business at some multiple of its annual profit, giving founders who had built a strong brand a real opportunity to cash out rather than continuing to bear platform risk indefinitely. But many of these aggregators discovered, sometimes only after spending hundreds of millions of dollars acquiring dozens of brands, that the efficiencies they expected from consolidation were harder to realize in practice than the model assumed, because each acquired brand still carried its own individual platform dependency risk, and a downturn in Amazon's advertising costs or a shift in the platform's own algorithm could compress margins across an entire portfolio simultaneously, regardless of how well any individual brand had been run before acquisition. Several of the largest aggregators in this space have since written down the value of their acquisitions substantially or scaled back their buying activity considerably. A reminder that combining many businesses that all share the same single point of failure doesn't actually eliminate that failure point. It just concentrates it under one larger balance sheet. Here's a case study that shows exactly how this plays out. Multiple sellers who built successful multi-million-dollar brands almost entirely on Amazon have described the exact same failure sequence. A sudden account suspension, often triggered by an automated system flagging what turned out to be a false positive, a counterfeit complaint filed by a competitor, or a policy violation the seller genuinely did not commit, followed by weeks of frozen revenue while the appeal process ground forward with no clear timeline or transparency into what evidence Amazon was actually evaluating. For a seller who had reinvested most of their profit back into more inventory rather than holding cash reserves, exactly the kind of aggressive reinvestment strategy that's often celebrated as smart business practice in seller communities, a suspension lasting even a few weeks could create a genuine cash crisis, unable to pay suppliers for inventory already ordered, while simultaneously unable to sell the inventory already sitting in Amazon's warehouses. Some of these sellers eventually recovered their accounts after lengthy appeals. Others did not, and watched years of built-up brand equity and customer reviews simply disappear, unable to be transferred to any other sales channel because the reviews, the search ranking, and the customer relationships all belonged to a listing on a platform they never actually controlled. This pattern has pushed the more sophisticated operators in this space toward a strategy that looks a lot like the risk diversification we've seen play out in other capital-heavy industries throughout this series, deliberately building sales channels outside Amazon, even when Amazon remains the dominant revenue source, specifically so that a sudden suspension doesn't instantly zero out the entire business. This typically means investing in a standalone branded website, building an email list of repeat customers the seller actually owns and controls, and in some cases pursuing wholesale relationships with physical retailers, none of which generate revenue nearly as efficiently as Amazon's built-in customer base and search traffic, but all of which provide a genuine insurance policy against the single point of failure that pure Amazon dependency represents. Sellers who have built these parallel channels consistently describe them as unprofitable or barely break-even relative to their Amazon business, right up until the day their Amazon account gets suspended, at which point the unprofitable side channel becomes the only thing keeping the company alive while the appeal process plays out. So does owning a company that sells to Amazon actually work as a business? The answer depends on a small number of variables, and getting the fee structure and platform risk wrong has proven, repeatedly, to end businesses that looked genuinely thriving just months earlier. You need a genuine cost advantage or product differentiation strong enough to survive Amazon's referral fees, fulfillment fees, and mandatory advertising spend while still generating a real margin. Not just a margin that looks acceptable before those costs are fully applied. You need cash reserves sufficient to survive an account suspension lasting weeks or months, rather than reinvesting every dollar of profit back into more inventory the moment it arrives. And you need at least some sales channel outside Amazon's ecosystem, even an unprofitable one, purely as insurance against the single point of failure that platform dependency represents. In the optimistic scenario, you build a genuinely differentiated product, maintain disciplined cash reserves, and diversify enough of your revenue outside the platform that Amazon becomes a powerful growth engine rather than an existential dependency, and the business compounds into something a larger company might eventually want to acquire outright. In the pessimistic scenario, you build an entire company's revenue on a single platform's algorithm, reinvest every dollar of margin back into more inventory, and discover, usually with no warning at all, that the business you spent years building can be frozen by an automated system in an afternoon, with no guarantee anyone will ever explain exactly why. The product was never really the business. The listing, the reviews, the advertising spend, none of that is what actually determines whether this company survives. What determines survival is how much of the actual customer relationship, the actual sales channel, and the actual cash cushion you've built outside the one platform your entire revenue currently depends on. Everything else, the sourcing, the packaging, the keyword optimization, is just the expensive, competitive machinery built around a business model that only truly belongs to you the moment you stop needing Amazon's permission to keep running it.